27 years. That's how long my parents were married before my mother found out she'd been living with a stranger. I know that sounds dramatic. People say that all the time. I didn't even know him. And it's usually just a way of saying they'd grown apart, that the person who left the relationship wasn't the same person they'd married. But that's not what I mean. I mean, my mother literally did not know who my father was. She knew his name, she knew his face, she knew the way he took his coffee, black, no sugar, always the same chipped mug he refused to let her throw away. But the man behind all of that, she never met him at all. My name is Serena, and this is my mother's story. But it's also mine, because I spent 14 years trying to warn her, and 14 years watching her refuse to hear it. My mother, Helen, built everything she had from nothing. She grew up in a 2-bedroom house in Akron, Ohio, with her parents and 3 brothers, sharing a bathroom and summer clothes and the single-family car. She put herself through nursing school, worked night shifts at the county hospital, and by the time she was 35, she'd worked her way into a senior administrative role managing 3 outpatient clinics in the greater Columbus area. She was organized, brilliant, and deeply, stubbornly loyal. To a fault. To her own undoing, as it turned out. My father, whose name I'll just say is David, came into her life at a hospital fundraiser when they were both in their early 30s. He was charming in the way that certain men are, effortlessly, almost automatically. He had a firm handshake and easy laughter and a way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the room. He told her he was a financial consultant. He told her he loved her 6 months later. He told her a lot of things. They married when I was not yet born. I came along 2 years into their marriage, and then 4 years after me came my brother Weston. We grew up in a nice house in Dublin, Ohio. The kind of suburb where the lawns are always green and the neighbors wave from their driveways and everything looks, from the outside, like it's exactly what it's supposed to be. I was 13 the first time I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. It was a Saturday in November. My mother had sent me to the grocery store with my father to pick up ingredients for Thanksgiving dinner. We were 2 weeks out, but she was a planner. And while my father was comparing 2 brands of chicken broth in the soup aisle, his phone buzzed on the cart where he'd left it. I wasn't snooping. I genuinely just happened to look down at the screen because it was right there, and the name that came up wasn't one I recognized. Renata. Miss you already. He came back around the corner 2 seconds later, saw me looking, and the way his expression shifted, just for a half second, before the easy smile came back. I knew. I didn't have a word for it at 13, but I knew. I didn't say anything that day. I was a child. I didn't know what to do with what I'd seen, but the knowing didn't leave me. Over the next 2 years, I watched more carefully. I noticed when my father said he had a conference in Chicago, and his breath when he came home smelled like a restaurant that wasn't room service. I noticed the way he sometimes got a call and walked to the far end of the backyard to take it, standing near the fence line with his back to the house. I noticed the way my mother noticed none of it, or if she did, she filed it somewhere out of reach. I was 15 when I finally said something. We were in the kitchen, just the 2 of us. My mother was making pasta and I was sitting at the island pretending to do homework. I don't even remember exactly how the conversation started. I think I just said it, Mum. I think Dad might be seeing someone else. She set the wooden spoon down on the counter very carefully. She turned around and looked at me the way you look at someone who has just said something but doesn't quite compute. And then she said, "Serena, your father has given everything to this family. I think you've been spending too much time online." That was it. That was the whole conversation. I tried once more, 3 months later, after I saw my father coming out of a coffee shop in Easton with a woman I'd never seen before. They were laughing, and his hand was at the small of her back in a way that wasn't casual. I told my mother. I described the woman, the coffee shop, the hand. My mother told me that my father mentored younger colleagues and that I was reading things into ordinary professional interactions, and that she would appreciate it if I stopped making accusations about my father based on things I didn't understand. I stopped trying. I went to college at Ohio State and I didn't go home much. I got my degree in paralegal studies and then went back to school for my JD. I made a life in Pittsburgh. My mother and I talked on the phone, but we talked around things the way families do when there's a shape in the room that nobody wants to name. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that for years my father had been quietly dismantling the financial structure of their life together. It came out later, during the investigation, but I'll tell you now so you understand the full picture. My father's consulting work had never been especially lucrative. It was my mother's income, her salary, her benefits, her retirement accounts, that had paid the mortgage, the cars, the vacations, Weston's tuition, everything. My father had always managed the joint accounts. My mother trusted him because she was busy and he offered, and she believed that in a marriage, some things just get divided and you let the person with more time handle their area. He had, over about 6 years, slowly redirected money. Small amounts at first, then larger. He had opened accounts she didn't know about. He had taken out a home equity line of credit on the house without her signature. She found out later that her signature had been forged. He was building a cushion, a getaway fund, a life he was planning to step into while leaving her with almost nothing. The woman from the coffee shop, Renata, had been in the picture for at least 8 years by the time everything collapsed. She lived in Indianapolis. She was younger than my mother by about 12 years. My father had been talking about retiring, and the two of them moving somewhere warm. The plan, as far as investigators were able to piece it together later, was this. My mother had a heart condition. It wasn't severe, but it was documented. She took a low-dose beta blocker daily. My father, over several months, had been very gradually increasing her dose, adding crushed medication to her morning tea, which she always drank before her pills, which meant she was getting far more than her prescribed amount. At the levels he'd reached by that November, she was at real risk of a cardiac event. He had also, and this is the part that still makes me feel like the floor is dropping, taken out a substantial life insurance policy on her 14 months earlier, increasing her existing coverage to a payout of $1.8 million. He didn't need her to disappear. He needed her to die quietly, of what looked like her own heart giving out, her own documented, pre-existing, unremarkable heart condition. I didn't know any of this yet. On the Tuesday, I got a call from a hospital in Wheeling, West Virginia. My mother had collapsed on an Amtrak train, somewhere between Columbus and Pittsburgh. She had been traveling to visit me, a trip she'd planned for Thanksgiving, something we'd arranged over the phone 3 weeks earlier. She had boarded the train in Columbus at 11:40 in the morning. A conductor found her unresponsive in her seat about an hour into the trip, and the train had made an emergency stop. The nurse who called me said, "Your mother is stable, but she presented with symptoms consistent with beta blocker toxicity. We need to ask you some questions." I was already in my car before she finished the sentence. I drove to Wheeling in just under 2 hours. I remember almost nothing about the drive except that my hands were completely steady on the wheel, and I was absolutely terrified. When I got to the hospital, my mother was awake but exhausted and confused. She knew who I was. She knew her name. But she was slow, the kind of slow that isn't tired. It's something chemical, something that's been done to a person's body without their knowledge. The attending physician, a calm woman who spoke to me like I was competent to handle information, walked me through what they'd found. My mother's beta blocker levels were nearly 4 times her prescribed therapeutic range. This did not happen by patient error, she said, unless the patient had dramatically misread instructions or accidentally double and triple dosed repeatedly over a period of months. "Has she had access to additional medication?" the doctor asked me. "I don't know," I said, "but her husband manages the household." The doctor looked at me for a moment. "I think," she said carefully, "that you may want to contact someone." I called the police from the hallway outside my mother's room, and then I called a colleague in Columbus who did criminal defense work and asked him to recommend the best criminal investigator he knew, because I was a lawyer and I knew this was going to need to be built carefully if it was going to hold. My father, meanwhile, was in Columbus. He had driven my mother to the train station that morning, seen her off, gone home. When I called him from the hospital, I did call him, because I needed to know what he would do. He was the picture of a worried husband. Shocked. Asking the right questions. Saying he'd get in the car right away. Don't, I said. I'll keep you updated. He didn't push back, which told me something. Over the next 72 hours, while my mother recovered in that hospital in Wheeling, I worked. I called my contact in Columbus. I called a pharmacist friend to walk me through the toxicology. I drove back to my parents' house in Dublin. I had a key. I'd always had a key. And I went through my father's home office with gloves on, photographing everything I touched before I moved it. What I found in that office took my breath away. There was a folder, a physical folder, which I would not have expected from someone trying to hide things, but people get careless when they think they're safe, containing printed statements for 2 accounts I had never seen before. One was a savings account with a balance of $214,000. One was a brokerage account. There was also a document that appeared to be a draft letter to a real estate agent in Sarasota, Florida, about a waterfront property. There were 2 names on the draft, my father's and Renata's. There was also, tucked in the back of the folder beneath a stack of old utility bills, a printed copy of my mother's life insurance policy, the one he'd increased 14 months ago. The one she had never mentioned to me because she hadn't known it had been changed. I photographed everything, replaced everything, relocked the office, and drove back to Wheeling. My mother was sitting up in bed eating hospital jello when I came in. The colour was coming back to her face. She looked tired and older than she had looked at Thanksgiving last year, and also, somehow, more like herself than she had in years. Like whatever had been dulling her had started to lift. "Something's wrong," she said when she saw my face. "Yes," I said. I sat down in the chair beside her bed. "And I need you to listen to me, Mum. Not the way you listened when I was 15, the way you should have listened then. Can you do that?" She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, "Tell me." So I told her. I told her about the blood levels. I told her about the accounts. I told her about the insurance policy. I told her about the folder in the office and the letter to the Sarasota realtor and the name Renata, which I had to explain to her had been the same name on a text message I'd seen on a phone screen in a grocery store in November 22 years ago, when I was 13 years old and didn't yet have the vocabulary for what I was looking at. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. 22 years, she finally said. Yes, and I told you you'd been spending too much time online. You did. She closed her eyes. And then she said something I hadn't expected. I knew. I think I always knew. I didn't let myself. She stopped. I thought if I just kept going, kept building things, kept holding it together, it would eventually become true, that he would become the person I needed him to be. I reached over and took her hand. He tried to kill you, Mom. She nodded. She didn't cry. She just nodded, like a woman accepting something she had been half expecting for a very long time. The investigation moved quickly once the hospital's report was submitted. The detective assigned the case was thorough in the way that people who take financial crimes against women seriously are thorough. He pulled bank records, subpoenaed phone records, contacted the insurance company, and within 10 days had located Renata in Indianapolis, who, when confronted with the evidence, cooperated fully in exchange for being removed from the investigation. She claimed she hadn't known about the insurance policy. She claimed she hadn't known about the medication. Investigators believed her on the first count. They were less certain about the second. My father was arrested on a Thursday morning at home in Dublin, still in his bathrobe. He did not resist. He asked apparently if he could finish his coffee first. His attorney tried several strategies over the following months. The medication levels could have been an error. My mother had a history of taking more than prescribed during stressful periods. The financial accounts were separate because my father had been planning a birthday surprise. None of it held. The forged signature on the home equity line had been identified by a forensic document examiner. The insurance policy timing was documented. The toxicology was documented. The real estate correspondence was documented. He pled guilty to aggravated assault, financial fraud, and forgery. He was sentenced to 11 years. He will be eligible for parole in 8. Renata disappeared back into her life in Indianapolis. I have no legal avenue for what she may or may not have known, and I made my peace with that. My brother Weston didn't speak to me for 4 months after the arrest. That's the part I don't talk about as much because it's harder to explain. Weston had lived with my father in Columbus after college. He'd taken a job at a company my father had recommended, had borrowed money from my father when he needed it, had built a relationship with our father that was closer and more transactional than mine had ever been. He knew, I think, in the same general way that I had known at 13, the shape of something wrong that he chose not to examine. But he had more to lose from the examining, so he hadn't. When everything came out, Weston's first instinct was not to call our mother. It was to call me and tell me I had overstepped, that I had destroyed the family, that I could have come to him first or to Dad and talked it through before bringing in the police. I said, he was poisoning her, Weston. He said, you don't know that for certain. I said, the toxicology report does. He hung up. For 4 months we didn't speak. My mother didn't pursue him. She was focused on her own recovery, on transferring the accounts, on meeting with financial advisors to understand what she still had and what had been taken. She had lost about $60,000 in the redirect over the years. The equity line was more complicated. The legal process to address the forged signature took time, but she had her salary, her retirement, her clinics. She had not, as it turned out, lost everything. She had come close. She had come very close. Weston showed up at her house on a Sunday in March. He stood on the porch, and when she opened the door, he said, "I'm sorry." 2 words. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, and then she stepped back and let him in. She told me later that he cried at the kitchen table for 20 minutes. That he said he had known something was wrong for years and had told himself it wasn't his business, that it was between his parents, that he didn't want to know the details. She told me, she said to him, "I can forgive you for not knowing what to do with it. I can't forgive you for asking your sister to have done nothing." He didn't argue with that. Good, they are rebuilding, slowly. It's complicated in the way that family things always are. You can't fully undo what got undone, but you can, maybe, build something different on the other side of it. My mother retired from her administrative role last spring. She still consults part-time. She takes long walks in the mornings. She adopted a dog, a scrappy little terrier mix named Biscuit, who she sends me photos of constantly, which I love. She looks, honestly, lighter than she has looked in as long as I can remember. Like a woman who has set down something extremely heavy and is still occasionally surprised to find her arms empty. She called me last month and said, "I want you to know something." I said, "What?" She said, "When you were 15 and you told me about the coffee shop. I believed you. I believed you the moment you said it. I chose not to. And I need you to know that that was the worst thing I've ever done, and I've had to live with it for a long time, and I'm sorry." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "I know, Mom," and I meant it. Some things don't have clean endings. The money isn't fully recovered. My brother is a work in progress. My father will be in his 70s when he gets out, if he gets out. And I have decided I will feel whatever I feel about that when the time comes, rather than spending the next several years pre-deciding. But my mother is alive. She is walking her terrier in the mornings and consulting part-time and calling me too often with photos of Biscuit. She almost wasn't. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Not the money, not the fraud, not even the betrayal of 27 years, though all of that is real and all of it mattered. What I keep coming back to is the train to Wheeling, the conductor finding her in that seat. The 2 hours I drove without remembering how close it was. If she had finished that tea, if the dose had been just a little higher, if the conductor had checked 10 minutes later, she was almost a woman who died quietly of her own heart giving out. Pre-existing condition. Documented. Unremarkable. She almost became a story nobody would have known to tell.